Welcome back to Silent Screams. Today, I want to share with you something that still haunts me to this day. It's a story about a place where reality and the supernatural seem to collide. Bhangarh Fort, a place notorious for being one of the most haunted locations in India. People say no one should enter the fort after sunset, but I was never one to believe in ghost stories until I had no choice. What happened that night has stayed with me, creeping into my thoughts at the most unexpected times. I survived, but not without scars that may never heal. The legend of Bhangarh Fort intrigued me for years. There were so many stories swirling around this place, tales of curses, doomed lovers, and vengeful spirits. It was said that anyone who dared to stay overnight in the fort would either lose their mind or never be heard from again. And while I loved a good ghost story, I never believed in them, not really. That was before I decided to see Bhangarh for myself. I set out on the journey with two of my friends, Raghav and Meera. They were just as excited as I was, maybe even more. None of us had ever experienced anything remotely paranormal, and we thought this trip would just be a fun, spooky adventure. A chance to laugh at the creepy myths and say we've been to the most haunted place in India. We arrived at the fort just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky was a deep, bloody orange, casting long shadows over the crumbling walls of the fort. The air was dry, the heat oppressive, even in the fading light. The entrance loomed before us, towering and ancient, covered in vines and dust. It looked like it hadn't been touched in centuries. "Doesn't seem that bad," Meera said, her voice light, though I could hear the tension underneath it. "Yes, spooky but not terrifying," Raghav added with a grin, pulling out his phone to take a few photos. We pushed the heavy wooden gate open, its creak echoing through the empty courtyard inside. The fort was massive, its once grand structures now decayed and overrun by nature. The silence was heavy, like the place had been holding its breath for centuries. And yet, despite the stillness, there was something unsettling about the air. It felt thick, almost oppressive, as if the very walls were watching us. "Okay, this is starting to feel weird," Meera muttered, glancing around nervously. I didn't think it would feel so empty. I felt it too. An odd tension in the air, like we weren't supposed to be there. But I pushed the thought away. We were just letting the stories get to us. The sun had nearly set by then, and the shadows were growing longer, swallowing the fort in darkness. We wandered deeper into the ruins, exploring the old temples and courtyards. The sky had turned a deep purple now, the first stars beginning to blink into view. That's when the wind started to pick up. "Is it me, or did it just get colder?" Raghav asked, rubbing his arms. The temperature had dropped suddenly, unnaturally fast. A sharp, biting cold that had no place in the desert air. I was about to answer when we heard it, the sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the empty courtyard. We all froze, turning around in unison. There's no one there. "Did you hear that?" Meera whispered, her voice shaky. "I'm sure it's just the wind," I said, though my heart was pounding in my chest. But then the footsteps came again, closer this time, louder. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was walking toward us. "Let's just keep moving," Raghav suggested, his voice tense. We hurried along the path, but the footsteps followed, matching our pace. We couldn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable, footsteps coming closer and closer. As we rounded a corner, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of a shadow, moving swiftly behind one of the pillars. But when I looked again, it was gone. My stomach twisted in fear. Something was definitely wrong. "I think we should leave," Meera said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Agreed," Raghav said quickly, looking around nervously. "This place is giving me the creeps." But as we turned to head back to the entrance, we realized something horrifying. The gate, the massive wooden gate we had entered through, was now closed, and no matter how hard we pushed, it wouldn't budge. "We didn't close that, right?" Raghav asked, his voice trembling. "No," I said, my voice barely steady. "No, we didn't." Panic began to set in. We were trapped. And the footsteps, they were still there, growing louder, closer. They were no longer behind us. They were everywhere, surrounding us. Suddenly, Mira let out a gasp, clutching my arm. Look, she pointed toward one of the ancient doorways. Standing in the shadow of the arch was a figure, a woman dressed in a flowing white sari, her face obscured by her long dark hair. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at us. Who is that? Raghav whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know, I said, my heart hammering in my chest. But we need to leave. Now, we turned to run, but the air around us seemed to thicken, like we were moving through water. The footsteps were deafening now, echoing all around us. And the woman, she was moving closer. I glanced back, my breath catching in my throat. She was right behind us, her hair still covering her face, her pale hand reaching out toward me. I felt a cold, unnatural chill crawl up my spine as her fingers brushed my shoulder. I froze in place, my body refusing to move, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Run! Mira screamed, yanking me forward. We bolted through the ruins, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that woman. But no matter how far we ran, the footsteps followed. We could hear her, feel her presence looming behind us. But whenever we turned to look, there was nothing. The fort had become a labyrinth, the walls shifting and changing as we ran, leading us deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, Raghav stopped, his eyes wide with terror. Do you hear that? I strained to listen. The footsteps had stopped, but there was something else now, a low, guttural whisper, echoing through the air. It was a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, hatred, and something far worse, hunger. We need to get out of here, I said, my voice shaking. But there was no way out. The fort had become a prison, its ancient walls closing in around us. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all we could hear. And then, from the shadows, she emerged again. The woman. Only now we could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids, her skin pale and cracked like old parchment. And her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, rotting teeth. She reached out toward us again, her fingers long and bony, her nails blackened and broken. Leave, she hissed, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. Leave this place. We're trying. Mira screamed, tears streaming down her face. But there was no escape. The fort had us now, and it wasn't going to let us go. I could feel it, an overwhelming sense of dread, of being trapped in a nightmare that we couldn't wake from. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to tremble, the walls shaking violently. Dust and debris rained down from above as the fort groaned and creaked, as if it were alive, trying to swallow us whole. We have to get out of here, Raghav yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward a narrow passageway. We sprinted down the corridor, the walls closing in around us, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. I could feel the woman behind us, her cold breath on the back of my neck, her twisted fingers reaching for me. And then, just as we reached the end of the passage, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the footsteps ceased, and the air became still. We skidded to a halt, panting and gasping for breath. The passageway had opened into a large chamber, its walls lined with ancient carvings and faded murals. In the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in thick red dust. For a moment, we thought we were safe. But then, from the shadows, the woman appeared again. Only now she wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, twisted, deformed shapes, their faces contorted in agony, their bodies covered in wounds and scars. They shuffled toward us, their hollow eyes fixed on us, their mouths opening in silent screams. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. This can't be real, I whispered, shaking my head. This can't be happening. But it was real, and it was only going to get worse. The last thing I remember is the cold, skeletal fingers wrapping around my throat, the woman's hollow eyes staring into mine as the darkness swallowed me whole. And then nothing. The moment those cold fingers wrapped around my throat, I thought it was the end. Everything went black, and for a brief second, I felt myself slipping away into some dark void. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the grip loosened. I gasped for air, collapsing onto the dusty stone floor, coughing violently as I tried to fill my lungs with the cold, stale air around me. When I opened my eyes, the room was still dark, but the terrifying figures, the woman, the twisted souls, they were gone. It was as if they had vanished into the air, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence that clung to the fort like a shroud. My heart was pounding in my chest, my whole body trembling with fear and exhaustion. But I was alive. Mira, Raghav, I croaked, my voice hoarse. I forced myself to stand, my legs wobbling beneath me. The chamber was dimly lit now, an eerie glow radiating from the stone walls. I could barely make out the altar in the center of the room, covered in that same thick red dust. The silence was overwhelming, deafening. But there was no sign of my friends. Panic surged through me as I stumbled forward. Mira, Raghav, I shouted, my voice echoing off the ancient walls. But there was no response. No footsteps, no whispers, just the dead, suffocating quiet of the fort. I could feel something was wrong, terribly wrong. It wasn't just that they were missing. It was the feeling that this place had swallowed them. The air was thick with something more than fear, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for us, waiting for me. I forced myself to move, to find a way out of this cursed room. Every step felt like it was dragging me deeper into the fort's grasp, the darkness closing in around me with every breath. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting and warping as I passed. I could hear faint whispers again, too soft to understand, but chilling enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a sound. A low, pained groan coming from one of the passageways. My heart leapt into my throat as I rushed toward it, praying that it was Raghav or Mira. But as I turned the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was Raghav, lying on the ground, his body twisted unnaturally, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His eyes were wide open, staring into nothing, his mouth moving as if he was trying to speak, but no words came out. Raghav, I shouted, dropping to my knees beside him. I shook him, trying to get him to respond, but his body was limp, his skin cold to the touch. Then, as if in response to my touch, his eyes slowly moved to meet mine. But they were wrong, empty, soulless. I felt my heart skip a beat, a deep, primal fear gripping me as I stared into his lifeless gaze. Get out, he whispered, his voice barely audible, each word dripping with pain and dread. She's coming. Before I could react, a bone-chilling cold swept through the room, and the shadows around us began to twist and writhe. I looked up in horror as the same woman from before materialized from the darkness, her hollow eyes fixed on me, her twisted smile growing wider. No, no, I screamed, scrambling backward, pulling Raghav's body with me. But it was too late. She was already moving toward us, her feet gliding soundlessly over the stone floor. I could feel her presence like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating, freezing my blood. I tried to stand, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. She was right in front of me now, her rotting hand reaching out toward my face. Her fingers were so close, I could feel the icy air around them. And then, just as her hand was about to touch me, something else broke through the oppressive silence. A voice faint, but unmistakable. Run. It was Mira. I could barely make out her form in the darkness behind the spirit. But there she was, standing in the doorway, her face pale and terrified. Run now. The woman's head snapped toward Mira, and in that split second, the hold she had on me loosened. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Raghav's arm, pulling him to his feet, even though he could barely walk. We stumbled toward Mira, the three of us moving as fast as we could down the narrow passageway. The fort had turned into a maze, the walls shifting and closing in around us as we ran. The sound of footsteps, her footsteps, followed us, echoing through the corridors. Every time I looked back, I could see her floating just behind us, her twisted smile never faltering. "We have to get out of here," Mira screamed, her voice desperate. "But how?" I shouted, my lungs burning from the effort of running. "The gate was locked." "I saw something," she gasped, her eyes wild with fear. "Another exit, but it's risky. Anything is better than staying here." I yelled, adrenaline surging through me. Mira led the way through the labyrinth of ruins, her footsteps quick and determined. The fort groaned around us, as if the walls themselves were alive, shifting, changing, trying to trap us inside. The temperature dropped even further, and the air became thick, almost choking. I could hear her behind us, the spirit, her raspy breath, her whispered threats. She was getting closer. I could feel her cold presence creeping up my spine, her fingers almost brushing against me. There, Mira pointed ahead to a crumbling section of the wall. It was partially collapsed, leaving a narrow gap just big enough for us to squeeze through. We didn't have time to think. I pushed Raghav through first, then Mira, and finally myself. The stones scraped against my arms as I forced myself through the narrow opening, and for a moment, I thought I was going to get stuck. But then with one last effort, I was out. We tumbled into the open air, gasping for breath. The night sky stretched above us, the stars cold and distant. The fort loomed behind us, dark and silent now, as if it had never been alive with the horrors we had just witnessed. We're out," Mira panted, collapsing onto the ground beside me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Raghav was still unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. I looked down at him, my heart heavy with a mix of relief and dread. We had made it out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. "We need to get help," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to get out of here now." But as I stood up, I heard something, faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps coming from the fort. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. And there, standing in the shadows of the crumbling walls, was the woman. She was watching us, her hollow eyes glowing in the darkness, her twisted smile still etched across her decayed face. "We have to go," Mira whispered, her voice shaking. "She's not done with us." I didn't need to be told twice. We gathered Raghav between us and started running again, our legs barely able to carry us as we fled from the cursed fort. The sound of footsteps followed us, growing fainter as we put more distance between ourselves and the horror we had just escaped. But even as we reached the safety of the village, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The fort had let us go, this time. But I knew deep down that it was still watching, waiting for the right moment to pull us back into its grasp. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if we'd survive another night. That was the last time I set foot anywhere near Bhangarh Fort. To this day, I still hear those footsteps sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and still. It's as if the fort is reminding me that it's still there, waiting. I never saw Raghav again after that night. He disappeared a few weeks later, leaving no trace behind. Mira moved far away, and we never spoke of the incident again. But I know we're all still haunted by it in our own ways. As for me, I try to forget. But some nights, when the wind is just right, I can still hear her voice whispering my name. And I know that someday, somehow, she'll find me again.